Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Terence McKenna, the bard of botanical consciousness and prophet of the psychedelic gnosis. Together and apart, they explored the borderlands where imagination becomes reality, where the inner eye opens onto dimensions that reason cannot chart. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approached the imaginal realm. One, seeing it emerge from the depths of the unconscious through careful technique and psychological discipline. The other, discovering it, blazing forth in visions catalyzed by ancient plant medicines and crystalline molecules. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness, from the archetypal depths Jung mapped with such precision to the transdimensional territories McKenna encountered in states that dissolved the boundaries between self and cosmos. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most, the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Terence McKenna as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the beginning, there were two births separated by more than half a century. Two men born into worlds that could not have been more different, yet bound by an invisible thread that would lead them both into the most mysterious territories of human experience. Carl Gustav Jung entered this world on July 26, 1875, in the Swiss village of Keswil, on the shores of Lake Constance. His was a world of stone churches and stern Protestant theology, of classical education and the rigid certainties of 19th-century European rationalism just beginning to crack under the weight of its own contradictions. Terence Kemp McKenna was born on November 16, 1946, in the small town of Ponca, Colorado, into a post-war America still humming with industrial confidence and the suburban dream, yet already stirring with the countercultural currents that would soon sweep away the certainties of his parents' generation. Jung's childhood unfolded in the shadow of his father's religious crises, a pastor who spoke the words of faith from the pulpit while harboring private doubts that poisoned his spirit. The young Carl grew up between two worlds, the outer world of social propriety and religious observance, and an inner world populated by strange dreams and visions that he learned early to keep secret. He dreamed of a subterranean phallus enthroned in darkness, of God defecating on the Basel Cathedral, of a little mannequin carved from wood that he hid in the attic as his secret companion. These were not the visions one spoke of in polite Swiss society, not the thoughts that found easy welcome in the rational daylight world. And so Jung learned the art of living between inner and outer, between vision and reason, between the mysteries that called to him and the world that demanded conformity. His path led through medicine and psychiatry, through the Bergholzli Clinic in Zurich, where he worked with Egon Bleuler on the puzzling cases of schizophrenia, those shattered souls whose inner worlds had overwhelmed their capacity to function in the outer. He developed his word association tests, tracking the unconscious, complexes that disrupted the smooth flow of conscious response. He read Sigmund Freud's interpretation of dreams and felt the shock of recognition here was someone else who took the inner world seriously, who saw in the seemingly random productions of the psyche a hidden order and meaning. Their collaboration bloomed and then famously shattered, leaving Jung to navigate his own descent into the unconscious, what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious, a period from 1913 to 1919, when he deliberately allowed the images of the deep psyche to arise and engaged them through what he came to call active imagination. This technique, active imagination, would become one of Jung's central methodologies, his way of accessing the symbolic and archetypal dimensions of the psyche without losing the ground beneath his feet. It required maintaining consciousness while allowing the unconscious to present its figures and dramas. You sat in, meditation, or you drew, or you painted, or you sculpted, and you invited the figures that lived below the threshold of awareness to emerge. When they came, and they did come, as gods and demons and wise old men and mysterious women, you did not simply observe them as a scientist might observe specimens under glass. No, you engaged them, spoke with them, asked them questions, listened to their replies, but always, you maintained your ego consciousness, your sense of being a separate entity in dialogue with these inner figures, rather than identified with them or possessed by them. For Jung, this was crucial. The difference between active imagination and psychosis lay precisely in this maintained dialogue, this preserved boundary between the conscious ego and the unconscious contents. The schizophrenic patients he had worked with at the Bug Holsley had lost this boundary. They had become identified with archetypal figures. They were Napoleon. They were Christ. They were persecuted by devils or chosen by God. The ego had dissolved into the collective contents and lost its capacity for relationship and integration. Jung's method sought to walk a careful line to open to the unconscious depths without being overwhelmed by them, to receive the archetypal images without inflating into identification with them. Through this painstaking inner work, Jung mapped what he came to see as the collective unconscious, that deeper stratum of the psyche that contains not personal memories and complexes, but universal patterns and images, the archetypes. These archetypes manifested in myths and fairy tales, in religious symbols and alchemical images, in the dreams of patients and the visions of mystics across cultures and centuries. There was the Great Mother in her dual aspects of nurturer and devourer, the wise old man who appears as guide and teacher, the shadow that carries all we have rejected in ourselves, the anima and animus as the contrasexual, aspects of the psyche, and ultimately the self, that paradoxical center and totality of the psyche that Jung saw as the goal of psychological development. The process he called individuation was the gradual realization and integration of these archetypal contents, the journey toward wholeness in which the ego learns its proper relationship to the self, not inflated identification, not fearful rejection, but conscious relationship. This was Jung's lifelong work, and it required tremendous discipline, tremendous groundedness in ordinary reality, even while exploring the extraordinary dimensions of the psyche. He maintained his psychiatric practice, his home life with his wife Emma and their 5 children, his tower at Bollingen where he worked with stone and wood and earth, always returning from his voyages into the imaginal realm to the solid ground of daily existence. By the time Jung died in 1961, at the age of 85, he had constructed a vast edifice of psychological thought, had written volumes exploring the symbolic dimensions of alchemy and Christianity and world mythology, had introduced concepts like synchronicity and the collective unconscious that would influence thinkers far beyond the narrow confines of academic psychology. His was a life of careful exploration, of mapping territories that most people never glimpse, of maintaining consciousness in the face of forces that could easily overwhelm it. He had learned to navigate the imaginal realm with a precision and care born of respect for its power and danger. Now turn your attention across the decades to Terence McKenna, born into a different world with different wounds and different possibilities. The young Terence grew up in a Catholic household in Colorado, an intelligent and curious boy, fascinated by the natural world, especially by butterflies and fossils, by the traces of ancient life and the beautiful complexity of metamorphosis. But unlike Jung, who had to contend with the rigid certainties of 19th century Swiss Protestantism, McKenna came of age in the 1960s, just as American culture was beginning its great psychedelic experiment. He attended the University of California at Berkeley, arriving there in 1965, just as the campus was becoming a cauldron of political activism and consciousness exploration. This was the world of the free speech movement and Vietnam War protests, of Timothy Leary's League for Spiritual Discovery and the Haight-Ashbury scene just across the bay in San Francisco. The certainties of the 1950s American consensus were dissolving, and young seekers like McKenna were eager to explore what lay beyond the conventional boundaries of consciousness. His path did not lead through medical school and psychiatric training, through the institutional structures that had shaped Jung's development. Instead, McKenna became a self-directed explorer, reading voraciously in philosophy and ethnobotany, in shamanism and psychedelic literature. He traveled to Nepal and India in 1967, seeking the hashish-shrouded insights of the East. He read Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception and Alan Watts's interpretations of Zen Buddhism and Taoism. He experimented with marijuana and LSD and began to sense that consciousness was far stranger, far more fluid and multidimensional than the materialist consensus would allow. But the real turning point came in 1971, when McKenna and his brother Dennis and a small group of friends traveled to the Colombian Amazon in search of ayahuasca and whatever other psychoactive plants they might encounter. They ended up at a mission station called La Correra, and there, in a series of experimental sessions with psilocybin mushrooms and other techniques, they had experiences that would shape the rest of Terence's life and thinking. Dennis underwent something like a psychological break, convinced that they had discovered a way to harness language and intention to alter reality itself at the molecular level. The experiment, whatever it was, did not work as planned, and Dennis descended into several weeks of confusion and terror before gradually returning to baseline reality. For Terence, La Correra was revelatory in a different way. He did not break down as his brother had, but he emerged, convinced that the psilocybin mushroom had granted him access to a form of knowledge that was somehow beyond the human, or at least beyond the normal channels of human knowing. In the high-dose mushroom state, he encountered what he would later describe as an entity, a presence, an intelligence, a voice that seemed to come from somewhere utterly other than his own psyche. This entity spoke to him in language of impossible complexity and beauty, revealing visions of human history and cosmic evolution, of patterns within patterns within patterns, of connections between the mathematical structure of time, and the flowering of consciousness and the ingression of what he would come to call novelty into the fabric of reality. Unlike Jung, who would have immediately suspected such an entity might be a projection of unconscious contents, an archetypal figure emerging from the collective depths, McKenna took the experience at face value as a genuine contact with something authentically other. The mushroom entity, as he came to think of it, became his teacher, his muse, his guide to territories that psychology, as Jung understood it, could not encompass. And where Jung had carefully maintained the boundary between ego and unconscious, McKenna came to celebrate the dissolution of that boundary, the ego death that allowed one to merge with the alien intelligence speaking through the psilocybin molecule. In the years after La Chorrera, McKenna became an eloquent advocate for what he saw as the consciousness-expanding properties of psychedelic plants and compounds. He earned a degree in ecology and resource conservation from Berkeley, writing his thesis on Amazonian shamanism and the use of ayahuasca. He learned to cultivate psilocybin mushrooms and shared this knowledge through his book, Psilocybin, Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide, published under a pseudonym. He moved to Hawaii and established a botanical garden of ethnobotanically significant plants, living a relatively quiet life while continuing his own explorations. But it was through his lectures and talks, especially those recorded in the 1980s and 1990s, that McKenna would reach his widest audience. He was a born orator with an astonishing vocabulary and a gift for weaving together insights from evolution and shamanism, quantum physics and medieval alchemy, linguistics and psychopharmacology, all in service of a vision that consciousness was on the verge of a great transition, an encounter with radical novelty that would transform the human species beyond recognition. His central theoretical contribution, if it can be called that, was the time-wave zero theory, developed partly from his interpretation of the Chinese I Ching. This mathematically based cosmology proposed that time was not the linear, uniform flow that modern physics described, but rather had a quality or structure that could be mapped as a wave of novelty and habit. According to this theory, history showed an increasing ingression of novelty of new forms, new patterns, new possibilities, accelerating toward a point of maximum novelty that McKenna calculated, somewhat playfully, would arrive in December of 2012. This endpoint of history he called the eschaton, the omega point, the moment when novelty reached such intensity that human consciousness would undergo a phase transition into something unimaginably different. Where Jung saw individuation as a gradual, lifelong process of integrating unconscious contents and finding the proper relationship between ego and self, McKenna envisioned a cosmic version of the same process history itself was individuating. Consciousness itself was evolving towards some ultimate flowering, and the psychedelic experience was not just a tool for personal growth or psychological healing, but a preview of this coming transformation, a glimpse into the hyperdimensional spaces that consciousness would soon inhabit permanently. Imagine now these two men, Jung and McKenna, separated by decades and vastly different contexts, one trained in medicine and depth psychology, the other self-educated in ethnobotany and shamanic cosmology. Jung died when McKenna was only 14 years old, so they never met, never engaged in actual dialogue, and yet their thinking converges and diverges in ways that illuminate both the common ground they shared and the fundamentally different assumptions that shaped their explorations. Both men took seriously the reality of visionary experience, the idea that inner imagery and symbolism could convey genuine knowledge rather than being mere fantasy or pathology. This was a radical stance in their respective eras. Jung had to contend with the reductionist materialism of early 20th century medicine, which saw visions and dreams as merely the confused noise of disordered brains. McKenna faced a different but related prejudice, the drug war consensus that saw psychedelics as dangerous substances that produced meaningless hallucinations and threatened the fabric of society. Both men insisted, against the scientific mainstream, that the imaginal realm was real in some sense, that it disclosed aspects of reality not accessible through ordinary perception and reason. Both were deeply influenced by alchemy, that strange medieval and Renaissance art that Jung had come to see as a symbolic representation of psychological transformation, and that McKenna saw as an actual encoding of shamanic knowledge about the transformation of consciousness. Both drew extensively on mythology and comparative religion, finding in the world's spiritual traditions glimpses of the transpersonal dimensions of human experience. Both were eloquent speakers and writers who could weave together disparate strands of knowledge into compelling visions of human possibility. And both were, in their different ways, responding to the crisis of modernity, the sense that Western civilization had lost touch with something essential, some dimension of experience and meaning that pre-modern peoples had known more intimately. Jung saw modern neurosis as partly rooted in the loss of living connection to the symbolic and mythic dimensions of existence, the reduction of life to material concerns and ego pursuits disconnected from the deeper self. McKenna saw a similar loss, a cultural forgetting of the visionary dimensions of consciousness that had been central to shamanic cultures, a forgetting enforced by the rise of patriarchal, dominator cultures that suppressed the ecstatic and the plant-based gnosis in favor of hierarchical control. Yet despite these convergences, their methods and their fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and reality diverged in ways that make their imagined dialogue endlessly fascinating. Jung approached the unconscious with the caution of someone who had seen what it could do to people when its forces were unleashed without adequate ego structure to contain them. His patience at the Bergholzli had taught him that the dissolution of ego boundaries was not liberation but catastrophe, not enlightenment but madness. His own confrontation with the unconscious had brought him to the edge of that dissolution, and he had survived by maintaining his practice, his family life, his connection to outer reality, even while entertaining the inner figures that arose. McKenna, by contrast, had not worked as a psychiatrist, had not spent his days with psychotic patients whose ego boundaries had shattered beyond repair. His experiences with psychedelics had been, for the most part, positive and revelatory, opening doors rather than trapping him in nightmares. Yes, he had witnessed his brother's breakdown at La Chorrera, but Dennis had eventually recovered, and the experience had not made Terence more cautious, but rather more convinced that something momentous was trying to break through into consciousness, even if the first attempts were chaotic and disturbing. Where Jung developed active imagination as a controlled technique for engaging the unconscious while maintaining ego boundaries, McKenna advocated the heroic dose 5 grams or more of dried psilocybin mushrooms in silent darkness, a dosage that would reliably dissolve the ego into the swirling, multidimensional spaces of the psychedelic gnosis. Where Jung insisted on integration, on bringing the contents of the unconscious into relationship with consciousness, McKenna celebrated the sheer otherness of the psychedelic dimension, the way it resisted integration into familiar frameworks, and instead demanded that one expand one's notion of what was possible. The cultural contexts that shaped these two men were vastly different. Jung came of age in a world where religious and philosophical certainties still held sway, where the primary challenge was to find one's individual path within or against those structures. McKenna came of age in a world where those structures had already fragmented, where the spiritual marketplace offered everything and nothing, where the primary challenge was to find any ground at all amid the proliferating possibilities. Jung sought to reconstruct a connection to the symbolic realm that modernity had severed. McKenna sought to accelerate the dissolution of modernity's certainties in service of a post-human emergence, and their political and social stances reflected these differences. Jung was, if anything, conservative in his social views, believing that societies needed their symbolic and religious structures, even if individuals needed to find their own authentic relationship to those structures. He was cautious about sudden transformations, suspicious of utopian visions, aware that the shadow lurked in every collective movement. McKenna was countercultural, anarchistic, optimistic about transformation, convinced that the current structures of civilization were not just limiting but actively toxic, that they needed to be transcended entirely rather than reformed or reinterpreted. As you drift deeper into rest, let your mind settle on this image. Jung in his stone tower at Bollingen, carefully carving mandalas and alchemical images, maintaining his daily routines, grounded in the earth and the work of his hands, even as his inner eye tracked the movement of archetypal forces. And McKenna in his Hawaiian garden, surrounded by plants that could alter consciousness, recording his talks about hyperdimensional elf machines and talking mushrooms and the end of history, spinning out visions of possibilities that reason alone could never reach. Two men, two paths into the imaginal, two maps of territories that do not appear on any ordinary atlas. The question that threads through their imagined dialogue is this: what is the status of the imaginal realm? Is it, as Jung believed, a dimension of the psyche, the collective unconscious with its archetypal structures that remain human and psychological even in their transpersonal depths? Or is it, as McKenna suggested, something genuinely other, a realm that exists independently of human consciousness and can be accessed through the portals that psychedelic molecules open in the neurochemical structures of the brain? Is the entity that McKenna encountered in the mushroom trance an autonomous intelligence from another dimension? Or is it what Jung would call an archetypal figure, a personification of unconscious contents that speaks with seeming autonomy but is ultimately a part of the psyche's own depths? These are the questions that will occupy the deep middle passages of our journey tonight, the comparative explorations that will carry you into sleep on currents of contemplation. But first, let us linger a little longer with the lives these men led, the paths that shaped them, so that when we turn to their ideas we can hear not just abstract theories, but the voices of particular human beings grappling with mysteries that touch them personally and profoundly. Jung's life after his break with Freud became an ongoing experiment in living from what he discovered in his confrontation with the unconscious. He did not abandon his psychiatric practice, did not retreat into mysticism or become a guru. He continued to see patients, to teach, to write, to maintain his family life, even as he pursued his extraordinary researches into alchemy and Gnosticism and Eastern religions and world mythology. His stone tower at Bollingen became a place where he could work with his hands, living simply without electricity or running water, carving images into stone and painting mandalas, letting the symbolic dimension of existence infuse his daily activities. He traveled to Africa and India and the American Southwest, seeking to understand how different cultures related to the unconscious, how the symbolic life took different forms in different contexts. His encounters with indigenous peoples, particularly the Pueblo Indians of New Mexico, gave him glimpses of what European culture had lost: a living relationship to the archetypal dimensions of existence, a psyche still embedded in nature and myth rather than cut off from them by the harsh light of rationalist consciousness. In his later years, Jung turned increasingly to the question of synchronicity, those meaningful coincidences that seem to violate the principle of causality, suggesting that mind and matter were not as separate as Cartesian dualism insisted. An event in the outer world and an event in the inner world, a dream, a thought, an emotional state, would coincide in ways that seemed too meaningful to be mere chance, but could not be explained by causal connection. Jung saw in synchronicity evidence that the psyche and the physical world were both manifestations of a deeper unity, what he called the unus mundus, the one world that expressed itself through both psychological and physical phenomena. This was a view that brought Jung close to certain mystical and Eastern philosophical positions, but he remained always a psychologist, always insisting that he was describing the psyche's experience rather than making metaphysical claims about the ultimate nature of reality. He could not know, he said, whether the archetypes were only psychological or whether they corresponded to something beyond the psyche. All he could do was describe how they manifested in experience, in dreams and visions, and synchronicities and mythological images. The psyche was his subject, and he would not claim knowledge. Beyond that domain, even when his findings pointed suggestively toward larger metaphysical questions. By the time of his death, Jung had become a world-renowned figure, his ideas spreading far beyond the confines of analytical psychology to influence art and literature, religious studies and anthropology, and the emerging human potential movement that would bloom in the 1960s and 70s. His autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, published posthumously, revealed more of his inner life than he had shared during his lifetime, describing dreams and visions and experiences that had shaped his understanding, but that he had kept largely private, knowing that they were too strange, too personal to be easily communicated. McKenna's life trajectory was quite different, more peripatetic, more focused on the exploratory journey than on the establishment of a practice or institution. After his transformative experiences in the Amazon, he spent years traveling and studying, developing his ideas through a combination of direct psychedelic experience, wide reading in various fields, and the synthesis of insights from disparate sources. He was a true autodidact, following his curiosity wherever it led, without concern for academic boundaries or disciplinary constraints. In the early 1980s, he began giving lectures and workshops, sharing his experiences and ideas with the growing subculture interested in psychedelics and consciousness exploration. His speaking style was unique, rapid-fire, dense with vocabulary and neologisms, weaving together scientific terminology and poetic imagery, serious philosophical argument, and outrageous speculation. He could talk for hours without notes, following associative chains through history and prehistory, quantum mechanics and linguistic theory, botanical pharmacology, and eschatological mythology. His lectures were often recorded, and these recordings circulated through underground networks, shared on cassette tapes and later as digital audio files, building his reputation as a visionary thinker and eloquent spokesman for the psychedelic experience. He appeared at conferences and on radio programs, wrote books that explored his theories in greater depth, and gradually built a following of people who found, in his words, permission to take their own visionary experiences seriously, to see them not as drug-induced hallucinations, but as genuine explorations of consciousness and reality. He married and had 2 children, maintaining a family life while continuing his explorations. He grew mushrooms and cannabis, cultivated his botanical garden, and continued to take what he called the heroic dose of psilocybin, venturing into those spaces where language breaks down and consciousness encounters its own limits. He spoke often of his conviction that the psychedelic experience was not fully communicable in words, that language could at best gesture toward it, that the only way to really understand what he was talking about was to have the experience oneself. Yet he continued to speak and write, pouring out words in his attempt to at least map the territory, to provide some indication of what lay beyond the ordinary boundaries of consciousness. He developed metaphors and models, speaking of the psychedelic state as a kind of trans-dimensional journey, as entering into information-rich spaces where the normal laws of physics did not apply, where thought and perception became fluid and interpenetrating, where one could encounter entities and intelligences that seemed absolutely real in the moment, even if their nature remained mysterious. His time wave zero theory became increasingly central to his public presentations in the 1990s, as the date he had calculated for the end of the wave, December 21st, 2012, approached. Critics pointed out that the mathematical basis for the theory was shaky at best, that the date had been chosen, somewhat arbitrarily, that the whole thing had more in common with apocalyptic prophecy than with science. McKenna himself seemed to hold the theory lightly in some moods, presenting it as a kind of myth or poetic speculation rather than a literal prediction. But he also maintained that there was something to it, that the acceleration of change in human culture over the last few millennia was real and was reaching some kind of climax. In 1998, McKenna began experiencing strange neurological symptoms. He was diagnosed with glioblastoma multiforme, an aggressive brain tumor. The irony was not lost on him, the eloquent speaker of consciousness in the brain, struck down by a malignancy in that very organ. He underwent surgery and treatment, but the tumor was inoperable. He spent his last months at his home in Hawaii, surrounded by friends and family, continuing to speak and reflect when his energy allowed, facing death with the same curious, exploratory spirit he had brought to consciousness. He died on April 3rd, 2000, at age 53, more than a decade before the date he had calculated for the time wave's end. His ideas lived on through his books and the many hours of recorded lectures, continuing to influence psychedelic explorers and consciousness researchers, remaining a touchstone for those who believe that the psychedelic experience revealed dimensions of reality that mainstream science and psychology were not yet equipped to understand. Now, as you rest deeper into your pillow, let us turn to the substance of their ideas, to the careful comparison that will show where their visions aligned and where they diverged into separate territories. This is the heart of our journey tonight, the place where we can let their 2 voices speak to each other across the years, where we can imagine what Jung might have said to McKenna's visions, and what McKenna might have replied to Jung's interpretations. Jung's concept of active imagination was, as we have said, a technique for engaging the unconscious while maintaining ego consciousness. It required a certain state of mind, relaxed but not asleep, receptive but not passive, open to whatever might arise but not identified with it. You might sit in a quiet space and simply wait, allowing your attention to shift from the outer world to the inner. Or you might begin with an image from a dream, holding it in your mind and seeing what happened next, letting the image develop as if it had a life of its own. Gradually, figures would emerge, sometimes human, sometimes animal, sometimes strange hybrid beings or personifications of natural forces. The important thing was to engage them in dialogue, to treat them as if they were independent personalities rather than mere fantasies. You would ask them questions. Who are you? What do you want? What do you have to tell me? And they would answer, not always in words, but sometimes in images or actions or transformations. The dialogue might continue for some time, with the ego and the unconscious figure working out some relationship, some understanding. The figures that appeared in active imagination were, for Jung, manifestations of the archetypes, those primordial patterns that structure the collective unconscious. The anima, the inner feminine in a man, might appear as a woman who would take him deeper into the unconscious realm. The shadow, the repressed and rejected aspects of the personality, might appear as a threatening figure who needed to be confronted and integrated. The wise old man might offer guidance or pose riddles. The various goddesses and gods of mythology might appear in their psychological aspect as structuring principles of the psyche. Jung was always clear that these figures, however autonomous they seemed, were ultimately aspects of the psyche itself, personifications of unconscious contents. They were real in the sense that they had genuine effects, genuine power to transform consciousness and behavior. But they were not external beings, not spirits or entities existing independently of the psyche that experienced them. This was a crucial distinction for Jung, one that separated his analytical psychology from spiritualism or occultism. He had seen patients who believed literally in the external reality of their visions, who thought they were in communication with spirits or possessed by demons. Such literalization, Jung believed, was dangerous because it gave away the psychological work. If the figure was an external spirit, then you could only supplicate it or exorcise it, but you could not integrate it, could not take responsibility for the psychological content it represented. The whole point of active imagination was to maintain the tension between ego and unconscious, to allow the unconscious to express itself without dissolving the ego structure that made integration possible. This meant that Jung approached visionary experiences with a certain hermeneutic suspicion. When a patient reported seeing Christ or encountering the devil, Jung's first question was not whether such entities existed externally, but what psychological state the experience represented. Was the ego inflating into identification with the archetype of the self, mistaking its own identity for that of the God image? Was the shadow being projected outward as a persecutory force rather than recognized as an internal split? The task was always to bring the experience back into psychological relationship, to interpret it in ways that made integration possible. This approach allowed Jung to take religious and mystical experiences seriously as psychological phenomena without having to make metaphysical commitments about the existence of God or spirits or other supernatural entities. The God image, for Jung, was a psychological reality, a manifestation of the archetype of the self, the totality and center of the psyche. Whether this psychological reality corresponded to something ontologically separate was a question Jung said he could not answer. All he could say was that human beings across cultures experienced something they called God, and this experience had profound psychological significance regardless of its metaphysical status. McKenna's approach to visionary experience was fundamentally different, born not from clinical work with patients, but from direct personal encounters with what he insisted were genuinely other intelligences. When he took a high dose of psilocybin in darkness and encountered what he called the mushroom entity, he experienced it not as an aspect of his own psyche, but as an autonomous being with its own agenda, its own knowledge, its own reality. The entity spoke to him in what he described as a kind of visible language, where meaning and form were identical, where the message was inseparable from the medium, where language became a three-dimensional object that could be rotated and entered into from different angles. This entity, according to McKenna, knew things that he did not know, could not know, through normal means. It showed him patterns in nature and in history, mathematical relationships and biological processes, cosmological visions and evolutionary trajectories. The information density of the experience was overwhelming, far beyond what his normal consciousness could integrate. It was as if, he said, he had gained access to a hyperdimensional database, a library of knowledge that existed outside of human culture and human brain structure. For McKenna, the psychedelic state was not just a reorganization of existing neural patterns, but a genuine expansion of consciousness beyond its normal boundaries. The brain, in his view, was not generating consciousness, but rather constraining it, filtering an infinite field of possible awareness down to the narrow band necessary for survival in ordinary reality. The psychedelic molecules disrupted these filters, allowing consciousness to expand into spaces that are always present but normally inaccessible. This was a view that aligned more with certain mystical and shamanic traditions than with Jung's psychological framework. McKenna often spoke of DMT, the compound found in ayahuasca and naturally produced in small amounts in the human brain, as the most powerful doorway into these other dimensions. A sufficient dose of DMT, vaporized and inhaled, would within seconds catapult consciousness into a fully formed alternative reality, complete with its own beings and landscapes and physics. These beings, often described as elves or jesters or alien intelligences, would interact with the person, showing them objects and processes, sometimes seeming to play or to teach or to simply celebrate the encounter. Were these beings aspects of the unconscious mind, as Jung would surely have said? McKenna thought not. They were too consistent across different experiences and different people, their behavior too autonomous, too independent of the expectations or psychological state of the explorer. They seemed to exist in their own right, in their own space, and the psychedelic state was simply the technology, chemical and neurological, that allowed human consciousness to visit their realm. Imagine Jung's response to this interpretation. He might point out that the consistency across experiences could be explained by the archetypal nature of these figures, that the collective unconscious contains universal patterns that different people experience in similar ways. The elves and aliens of the DMT state could be modern manifestations of the same archetypal trickster figure that appears as Coyote in Native American mythology, as Loki in Norse mythology, as Hermes in Greek mythology. The autonomy of their behavior could be explained by the fact that archetypal content is not under ego control, emerges from deeper structures of the psyche that are indeed independent of personal consciousness. Furthermore, Jung might say, the insistence on the external reality of these beings is precisely the kind of literalization that prevents psychological integration. If they are merely alien entities that we visit, then we learn nothing about ourselves from the encounter. We remain tourists in their space rather than engaging with the depths of our own psyche. The psychologically productive approach is to ask what these beings represent within the economy of the psyche, what message they bring from the unconscious, what aspect of the personality they personify. McKenna's response would likely be that Jung's psychological reductionism, however sophisticated, still failed to account for the radical otherness of the psychedelic experience. Yes, the psyche contains depths beyond the ego, contains archetypal structures that manifest in universal patterns. But the psychedelic state reveals something beyond even that, something that cannot be reduced to any psychological category because it transcends the human entirely. The mushroom entity, McKenna insisted, was literally not human, was not bound by human categories or human evolution. It was something from outside, something that had inserted itself into the terrestrial ecology as a kind of ambassador from the greater cosmos. This was McKenna's most radical claim, one that few even in the psychedelic community fully embraced, that the psilocybin mushroom was not native to Earth, that it represented a kind of interstellar spore that had arrived from elsewhere, bringing with it information and intention from beyond our planet. The mushroom's rapid growth, its production of a molecule that so profoundly affected human consciousness, its appearance in ancient shamanic practices around the world, all this suggested to McKenna that it was more than just a plant, that it was a technology for communication between species, between dimensions, between worlds. Here, the distance between Jung and McKenna becomes nearly absolute. Jung never ventured into speculation about extraterrestrial intelligence or interdimensional communication. His focus remained steadfastly on the human psyche and its development. Even when he explored synchronicity and the possibility that mind and matter were two aspects of a deeper unity, he framed it in terms of the psyche's relationship to the world, not in terms of literal contact with non-human intelligences. And yet, there is a strange symmetry between them. Jung's insistence that the psyche is not reducible to the personal ego, that it contains depths that are collective and archetypal and ultimately unknowable in their totality, opens a door that McKenna walks through in a different direction. If the collective unconscious contains patterns and potentials that precede individual experience, if it contains a kind of knowledge that is not learned but inherent in the structure of the psyche itself, then where does this knowledge come from? Jung traced it back through evolutionary history, suggesting that the archetypes were somehow inscribed in the biological inheritance of the human species, patterns that had proven adaptive over millions of years of evolution. But could one not equally say, as McKenna does, that this inherent knowledge points to something even deeper, some connection between consciousness and the cosmos that precedes biological evolution? McKenna's notion that the psychedelic state reveals cosmological truths, that it provides access to information about the nature of reality itself, is in some sense a radicalization of Jung's insight that the psyche is not just a product of individual experience, but contains transpersonal depths. Where Jung sought to domesticate these depths, to bring them into relationship with ego consciousness through the careful work of individuation, McKenna celebrated their wildness, their refusal to be integrated into ordinary frameworks. He spoke often of the importance of maintaining a sense of astonishment and strangeness in the face of the psychedelic experience, of not explaining it away or reducing it to comfortable categories. The ego death that high-dose psychedelics could induce was, for McKenna, not a danger to be avoided, but a gift to be welcomed, a temporary dissolution that allowed consciousness to expand beyond its usual boundaries and encounter the truly other. Jung would surely see in this celebration of ego death the same dynamic he had observed in psychotic breaks, the dissolution of the structure necessary for integration and relationship. Without ego, how can there be individuation? Without the maintained boundary between conscious and unconscious, how can there be dialogue and integration? The psychotic patient who believes he is God has lost the capacity for psychological development because he has identified with the archetype rather than relating to it. Is the psychedelic voyager who dissolves into the cosmic consciousness not making the same mistake? McKenna would respond that there is a crucial difference. The psychedelic dissolution is temporary and chosen. One enters into ego death knowing that one will return, that the boundaries will reassert themselves when the chemical wears off. This makes it an exploration rather than a catastrophe, a journey rather than a falling. And the insights gained in that dissolved state, the perspectives glimpsed from beyond the ego, can be brought back and integrated into ordinary consciousness once one returns. The ego is not destroyed but relativized, revealed as a necessary but limited structure rather than the totality of what one is. Moreover, McKenna might say, Jung's entire framework assumes that psychological health and development are the primary goals, that the purpose of engaging with the unconscious is to become a more integrated, individuated person. But what if there are other goals, other values? What if the purpose of consciousness is not just personal integration but cosmic exploration, the expansion of awareness into realms that have nothing to do with becoming a better functioning human being? What if the mushroom entity is trying to teach us something not about our personal psyches, but about the nature of reality itself, about dimensions of existence that psychology, as Jung conceived it, cannot even recognize? This question points to a fundamental difference in their orientations. Jung was ultimately a healer, someone whose primary concern was the alleviation of suffering and the promotion of psychological health and wholeness. His explorations of the unconscious were always in service of that goal, always oriented toward helping people live more authentic, more conscious, more integrated lives. The archetypal realm was fascinating and profound, but its significance lay ultimately in its effects on human life and human consciousness. McKenna was not primarily a healer, but an explorer, an adventurer of consciousness whose primary commitment was to the expansion of human awareness into new territories, regardless of whether that expansion led to greater psychological health or social function. He was fascinated by the extremes of consciousness, by the edge cases and the far reaches, by states so alien that they might teach nothing about ordinary life, but were valuable precisely for their strangeness and novelty. This difference in orientation shaped everything about their respective approaches. Jung developed therapeutic techniques, methods that could be taught and practiced, frameworks that could help both therapists and patients navigate the unconscious. His psychology was meant to be useful, to provide tools for the work of individuation. McKenna offered not techniques but testimony, not methods but provocation. He described what he had experienced and encouraged others to have their own experiences, but he did not pretend to offer a systematic approach to navigating the psychedelic realm. Each journey was unique, each encounter with the mushroom entity or the DMT elves was sui generis, teaching something that might or might not be communicable or useful. And yet their testimonies converge in describing a dimension of experience that exceeds the ordinary boundaries of ego consciousness, a realm where images and symbols carry meanings that reason alone cannot grasp, where consciousness encounters figures and forces that seem autonomous and other. Whether these are understood as archetypal aspects of the collective unconscious or as genuinely external entities from other dimensions, both Jung and McKenna insisted that this realm is real in some profound sense, that it cannot be dismissed as mere fantasy or hallucination. Let us examine more closely how each approached the question of entities and autonomous figures in the imaginal realm. For Jung, the appearance of seemingly autonomous beings in dreams and visions was one of the most important pieces of evidence for the reality of the unconscious as distinct from consciousness. The ego does not control these figures, does not create them deliberately. They appear of their own accord, speak their own words, follow their own logic. This autonomy is striking and can be unsettling. The person who encounters a powerful archetypal figure in a dream or vision often has the sense of confronting something utterly other, something that cannot be reduced to personal wishes or fears. Jung experienced this autonomy himself during his confrontation with the unconscious. He encountered a figure he called Philemon, an old man with the wings of a kingfisher, who walked in the garden of Jung's imagination and spoke to him of things Jung felt he did not know. Philemon became Jung's inner teacher, representing a wisdom that seemed to come from beyond Jung's own conscious knowledge. Jung wrote that Philemon and other figures brought home to me the crucial insight that there are things in the psyche which I do not produce, but which produce themselves and have their own life. This was the autonomy of the archetypes, the way they seem to have their own intentionality and agency. But Jung insisted that this autonomy existed within the psyche. Philemon was not an external spirit, but an internal figure, a personification of what Jung would later understand as the archetype of the wise old man, a structure of the collective unconscious that manifested in this particular form. The dialogue with Philemon was ultimately a dialogue between different aspects of Jung's own psyche, between consciousness and the deeper layers of the collective unconscious. This interpretation allowed Jung to take the experience seriously without committing to a spiritualist worldview. He did not have to believe in external spirits or discarnate entities to acknowledge the reality and power of these figures. They were psychologically real, which was sufficient. Indeed, Jung thought that the psychological interpretation was more profound than the spiritualist. 1. Because it recognized these figures as part of the deep structure of human being, rather than as visitors from some other realm. McKenna's encounters with entities in the psychedelic state had a similar quality of autonomy and otherness, but he interpreted them differently. The entities he encountered seemed not just autonomous, but alien, not just other, but other in a way that transcended the human entirely. They did not seem to be aspects of his personality or personifications of psychological functions. They seemed to be genuinely separate beings with their own existence, their own knowledge, their own purposes. In the DMT state, these entities would often seem to be aware of his presence, would respond to him, would interact with him in ways that suggested genuine intentionality on their part. They would show him objects, perform operations that resembled demonstrations or teaching, communicate through means that transcended language as he knew it. The whole encounter had the quality of a meeting between different species or different orders of intelligence, not an internal dialogue between ego and unconscious. McKenna often compared the DMT experience to the alien abduction phenomenon, suggesting that both might be encounters with the same kind of entities through different doorways. He was not convinced that the alien abduction reports were literally true in the sense of physical beings from other planets visiting Earth in spacecraft, but he thought they might represent genuine encounters with non-human intelligences that existed in dimensions accessible through altered states of consciousness. The DMT state was a reliable way to enter that dimension, while abduction experiences might represent spontaneous entry through some other mechanism. Jung would likely see in all of this a failure to recognize the psychological nature of the encounter. The alien entities of the DMT state, like the UFO encounters that fascinated the public in the 50s and 60s, represented archetypal contents constellated by the modern psyche's need for meaning and transcendence in an age that had lost its traditional religious frameworks. The aliens were modern versions of angels and demons, the gods and goddesses that earlier ages had experienced in ways appropriate to their cultural contexts. Jung actually wrote about UFOs late in his life in a book titled Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the skies. He analyzed the UFO phenomenon as a projection of the archetype of the self, the mandala shape of the flying saucer representing wholeness and totality in an age of fragmentation and anxiety. Whether or not physical UFOs existed, Jung said, the psychological significance of the phenomenon was clear. People were seeking transcendence, seeking contact with something greater than themselves, and the modern psyche clothed this archetypal need in the imagery of space-age technology. Similarly, Jung might say McKenna's DMT elves and mushroom entities were modern projections of archetypal trickster figures, the same energies that shamanic cultures had encountered as spirits or gods, but that the modern mind experienced in the context of psychedelic chemistry and science fiction cosmology. The content changed with culture, but the underlying pattern remained constant. The trickster appears at the boundaries of consciousness, disrupting order, playing with meaning, teaching through chaos and surprise. This is what McKenna's entities did, and this is what trickster figures have always done. But McKenna would insist that this interpretation, while clever, misses the point. The entities are not projections precisely because they behave in ways that are unexpected, that violate the expectations and desires of the person encountering them. They have their own agenda, their own style, their own knowledge. They are not serving the person's psychological needs, but revealing something about the nature of reality that transcends psychology. To reduce them to archetypal patterns is to tame them, to domesticate them, to fit them into a human framework when their whole significance lies in their escape from such frameworks. This is perhaps the central impasse between their views. Jung cannot acknowledge the radical autonomy and otherness that McKenna insists upon without abandoning the psychological framework that grounds all his work. To say that the entities are genuinely external, genuinely non-human, would be to step outside the boundaries of psychology into metaphysics or even theology. McKenna cannot accept Jung's psychological reduction without betraying what he experienced as the most important aspect of the psychedelic encounter, its revelation of dimensions of existence that are not psychological, not human, not reducible to any framework that begins and ends with the psyche. And yet both are describing encounters with something that has autonomous agency, that cannot be controlled by the ego, that brings knowledge or perspective that seems to come from beyond ordinary consciousness. Whether this beyond is understood as the depths of the collective unconscious or as genuinely external dimensions, both men agree that consciousness can expand to encounter it, that techniques and technologies exist for making contact with these realms. Let us consider their different approaches to the imaginal realm more carefully. Jung's active imagination, as we have said, was a careful, controlled practice. You set aside time, you created the proper conditions, you allowed the images to arise, and you engaged them with full consciousness. The process could be difficult and even frightening, but it was always bounded by your capacity to return to ordinary reality, to step back from the imaginal encounter and reflect on its meaning. The psychedelic experience, as McKenna described it, especially at high doses, did not offer such easy control. Once you had ingested the substance, you were committed to wherever it took you for the duration of its effect. With psilocybin, this might be 4 to 6 hours. With DMT, it might be only 10 to 15 minutes, but during those minutes, ordinary reality would completely dissolve, replaced by a realm so alien and intense that there was no possibility of maintaining the kind of conscious reflection Jung advocated. You surrendered to the experience, trusted the medicine, and tried to remember what you could when you returned. This difference in method reflects different understandings of the relationship between consciousness and the imaginal. For Jung, consciousness must be maintained even in the depths, must remain present as the observer and interlocutor who engages with unconscious contents. The ego might be relativized, might recognize its dependence on deeper sources, but it must not dissolve entirely, or else integration becomes impossible. For McKenna, consciousness can temporarily dissolve because the psychedelic state is self-limiting. The substance metabolizes, the experience ends, and one returns to ordinary consciousness whether one wills it or not. In the meantime, the complete dissolution allows for an expansion into spaces that could not be accessed if one maintained ego boundaries. The high-dose psychedelic journey is a kind of temporary death and rebirth, a dissolution and reconstitution that can be transformative precisely because it goes beyond what controlled techniques can reach. Jung knew about psychedelics, of course. Mescaline, the active compound in peyote, had been isolated in the 19th century, and various researchers had experimented with it. Albert Hofmann synthesized LSD in 1938 and discovered its psychoactive properties in 1943. Jung was aware of these substances and their effects, but he was deeply skeptical about their value for psychological work. He tried mescaline himself, at least once, and found the experience interesting but not particularly revelatory. The visions it produced seemed to him similar to what he could access through active imagination, but without the clarity and controllability of that technique. He worried that using substances to access the unconscious was a kind of shortcut that bypassed the hard work of psychological development. The visions might be spectacular, but what good were they if the person could not integrate them, could not bring their insights into relationship with conscious life? Moreover, Jung was concerned about the inflation that could result from powerful visionary experiences. The person who had glimpsed the archetypal realm through psychedelics might mistake the experience for enlightenment, might identify with the transpersonal contents they had encountered, might develop a sense of special knowledge or chosenness that was actually a symptom of ego inflation rather than genuine development. Without the proper preparation, the proper container, the proper integration, the psychedelic experience could be more dangerous than helpful. McKenna, of course, would say that Jung's skepticism reflected his lack of experience with the truly powerful psychedelics and at sufficient doses. Mescaline, while certainly psychoactive, was relatively mild compared to high-dose psilocybin or especially DMT. Jung had not encountered the mushroom entity, had not been blasted into the hyperdimensional spaces where the DMT elves dwell, and therefore could not speak to the full range of what psychedelics could reveal. His concerns about integration were valid, but could be addressed through proper set and setting, through community and practice, through the guidance of experienced explorers. The question of integration is crucial here and reveals different models of psychological development. For Jung, integration meant bringing unconscious contents into conscious relationship, making the unconscious conscious, expanding the ego's awareness to include what had been split off, or repressed, or simply unknown. This was a gradual process that unfolded over a lifetime, requiring continuous work and reflection. Dreams and visions were material for this work, but they needed to be understood, interpreted, related to the conscious personality. For McKenna, integration was less central to the enterprise. The value of the psychedelic experience lay partly in its very resistance to integration, its insistence on remaining other. Yes, one could bring back insights and perspectives that might influence one's life, but the core of the experience, the encounter with alien intelligence, the dissolution into hyperdimensional space, this could not be integrated in any conventional sense because it came from beyond the sphere where integration operates. Instead, McKenna emphasized what he called the felt presence of direct experience. The psychedelic journey was valuable in itself, not primarily for what it taught or how it changed you, but for the sheer fact of having encountered it. It expanded your sense of what was possible, revealed dimensions of reality that you might never have imagined, shattered any residual materialism or naive realism about the nature of consciousness and reality. This was not integration but revelation, not psychological development but cosmological education. We can hear in this difference an echo of the distinction between the mystic and the psychologist, between the via contemplativa and the via activa. Jung, for all his exploration of mysticism and alchemy and Eastern philosophy, remained fundamentally a this-worldly thinker, committed to the psychological and the human. His interest in the numinous was always in service of psychological health and development, always oriented toward helping people live more conscious and authentic lives in the world. McKenna, by contrast, was drawn to the otherworldly, to the transcendent, to the dissolution of ordinary reality in favor of visionary dimensions. He was suspicious of too much integration, too much grounding, too much commitment to psychological health, as conventionally understood. These could become, he thought, ways of domesticating the wild and alien dimensions of consciousness, of reducing them to the familiar and the comfortable. Better to remain a little unintegrated, a little strange, a little open to the unprecedented and the impossible. This brings us to their different relationships with language and communication. Jung was a careful, precise writer, trained in the academic and medical traditions of his time. He wrote voluminously, producing a collected works that runs to 20 volumes, exploring his ideas with scholarly apparatus, with references to source texts, with careful definitions of terms. His writing could be dense and difficult, but it aimed at clarity and communicability, at making his insights available to others who could study and apply them. McKenna, by contrast, was primarily a speaker rather than a writer. His books were often transcriptions of talks or relatively informal explorations of his ideas. His real medium was the lecture, the rap, the extended improvisation where he could follow associative chains and modulate his tone and rhythm in response to the audience. His language was extraordinarily dense with neologisms and technical vocabulary from multiple disciplines, yet also poetic and playful, reaching for metaphors that might convey something of the ineffable dimensions he was describing. Both men struggled with the limits of language, with the difficulty of conveying experiences that transcend ordinary categories. Jung developed a specialized vocabulary archetype, anima, shadow, self, individuation terms that he carefully defined and used with precision. This vocabulary was meant to create a shared discourse, a way for analysts and patients to talk about psychological processes with some rigor and clarity. McKenna also developed his own vocabulary, novelty, the time wave, the archaic revival, the felt presence of direct experience, the transcendental object at the end of time. But his terms were more poetic than technical, more suggestive than precisely defined. He was not trying to create a scientific psychology, but to evoke a sense of the dimensions he had explored, to give his listeners some flavor of the ineffable. And where Jung's language aimed at integration and understanding, at bringing the unconscious into conscious relationship, McKenna's language often emphasized the alien and incomprehensible aspects of psychedelic experience. He spoke frequently of the failure of language in the face of these experiences, of the impossibility of really conveying what happens in the deep psychedelic state. Language could gesture toward it, could create an atmosphere, could perhaps inspire others to seek the experience themselves, but it could not capture the thing itself. This reflects their different epistemologies, their different understandings of what knowledge is and how it is gained. For Jung, knowledge was something that could be articulated, studied, communicated through text and dialogue. The unconscious was mysterious and profound, but it could be known through careful observation and interpretation. The archetypes could be understood through the study of their manifestations in myth and symbol and individual experience. For McKenna, the deepest knowledge accessible through psychedelics was somehow beyond articulation, gnosis rather than understanding, direct acquaintance rather than description. You could not really know what the DMT state was like unless you had been there yourself. No amount of reading or talking about it could substitute for the direct experience. This is why McKenna so often encouraged people to try psychedelics themselves at sufficient doses, in proper circumstances. The experience was the teaching, not any verbal account of it. Jung would have been deeply uncomfortable with this emphasis on ineffable gnosis, seeing in it the potential for mystification and inflation, for claiming special knowledge that could not be communicated or tested or integrated into broader understanding. The psychological approach demanded that experiences be brought into language, made conscious, shared in ways that allowed for dialogue and development. The ineffable might be the starting point, but the work was to make it effable, to find words and symbols that could carry meaning from the unconscious into consciousness. Now, let us turn to their understandings of what we might call the cosmological dimension, the relationship between psyche and cosmos. Jung's notion of the collective unconscious implied that the psyche was not just a product of individual experience, but connected to something transpersonal, something that preceded and transcended the individual. The archetypes were patterns that all humans shared, regardless of culture or personal history. This suggested that the psyche had some kind of universal structure, that there were psychological constants that reflected the common evolutionary heritage of the human species. But Jung generally resisted extending this into a fully developed cosmology. He was a psychologist, not a metaphysician. He could describe the psyche's experience of connection to something larger, could note the parallels between psychological symbols and religious or mystical cosmologies, but he remained agnostic about the ultimate nature of reality beyond the psyche's experience of it. The collective unconscious was as far as he could go with certainty, because he was describing psychological phenomena, the contents and structures of the psyche as they manifested in human experience. McKenna, by contrast, developed an elaborate cosmology in which consciousness and the universe were intimately intertwined. His time wave theory proposed that time itself had a structure, a pattern of novelty and habit that had been unfolding since the Big Bang and was approaching a culmination. This pattern was not just a human phenomenon, but a cosmic one, expressed in the evolution of matter and life and consciousness, in the increasing complexity and differentiation of forms, in the acceleration of change, and the emergence of ever-new possibilities. In this cosmology, consciousness was not an accidental byproduct of biological evolution, but a fundamental feature of the universe, something that the universe was generating through its evolution, something that perhaps the universe was. The psychedelic experience, in revealing the depths and dimensions of consciousness, was therefore also revealing something about the nature of the cosmos itself. The boundaries between self and world, between consciousness and matter, between inner and outer, these dissolved in the psychedelic state, revealing their conventional and constructed nature, revealing a deeper unity. This was much closer to certain mystical and idealist philosophies than to Jung's carefully bounded psychological approach. McKenna spoke often of mind as primary, of matter as a phenomenon arising within consciousness rather than consciousness arising from matter. The materialist worldview that saw consciousness as an emergent property of brain activity was, for McKenna, exactly backward. The brain was not generating consciousness, but rather restricting it, filtering it, tuning it to a narrow bandwidth appropriate for biological survival. The psychedelic molecule disrupted this filtering, allowing consciousness to expand beyond the boundaries normally maintained by neurobiology. This is why the psychedelic state felt so expansive, so boundary dissolving. It was revealing consciousness as it actually is, vast and multidimensional, rather than consciousness as it appears when restricted to the requirements of embodied existence. The entities encountered in this expanded state were therefore not psychological constructs but inhabitants of the larger space of consciousness that the normal brain filters out. Jung, as we have said, would interpret this very differently. The sense of expanded consciousness, the dissolution of boundaries between self and world, the encounter with seemingly autonomous entities, all this was consistent with what he had observed in his own explorations and in his work with patients. But he would understand it as an expansion into the collective unconscious, into the archetypal dimensions of the psyche, not as a dissolution of the psyche into some cosmic consciousness. The collective unconscious was indeed collective, indeed transpersonal, but it was still psychological. It was the shared psychic substrate of humanity, not identical with the cosmos itself. The archetypes were human universals, not cosmic principles. To conflate the two was to fall into what Jung called psychic inflation, mistaking the contents of the collective unconscious for metaphysical realities, identifying the experiencing ego with the totality it experiences. This is one of Jung's central concerns, appearing again and again in his writing, the danger of inflation, of the ego mistaking itself for something larger. The person who identifies with an archetype, who believes themselves to be the chosen one, the savior, the prophet, has lost the crucial distinction between ego and self, between the limited conscious personality and the vast, unconscious depths. Such identification is grandiose and ultimately psychotic, cutting the person off from relationship and genuine development. McKenna might respond that Jung's concern about inflation reflects a certain timidity, a fear of the transpersonal that keeps one trapped in an overly narrow definition of the self. Yes, the everyday ego is limited and must be maintained for practical purposes, but why should we identify ultimately with that ego rather than with the larger consciousness revealed in expanded states? Perhaps the real inflation is the ego's insistence on its own primacy, its refusal to acknowledge the larger identity that includes and transcends it. This is the philosophical position known as perennialism or mysticism, the idea that the separate self is ultimately illusory, that our true identity is with the One, the Absolute, the cosmic consciousness. From this perspective, Jung's insistence on maintaining ego boundaries is a kind of halfway house, acknowledging the transpersonal but still clinging to the personal, still refusing the ultimate dissolution that would reveal consciousness as universal rather than individual. Jung was familiar with this perennialist position from his studies of Eastern philosophy and Western mysticism. He had deep respect for it, but remained skeptical about its psychological value, at least for Western individuals. The Eastern traditions that taught ego transcendence had developed over millennia within cultures that emphasized the collective over the individual from the start. Western culture, by contrast, had fought for centuries to establish the autonomy and value of the individual. To dissolve that hard-won individuality seemed to Jung a regression rather than a progression. Moreover, Jung thought that the goal of ego transcendence often masked a wish to escape from the difficulties and responsibilities of individual existence. It was easier to dissolve into the all than to do the hard work of becoming a conscious individual, of integrating the shadow, of taking responsibility for one's life. The mystical path could become an avoidance, a spiritual bypass that promised transcendence while leaving the actual psychological work undone. McKenna would likely counter that this analysis might apply to some seekers, but not to all, that the genuine mystical realization was not an escape, but a recognition, not a dissolution into unconsciousness, but an expansion into a larger consciousness. The ego death of the psychedelic experience was not a regression to infantile fusion, but a progression to a post-human perspective, a glimpse of what consciousness might become as it evolves beyond its current constraints. This brings us to their different understandings of the telos, the goal or direction of psychological and cosmic development. For Jung, the goal was individuation, the process by which a person becomes a psychologically integrated individual, undivided. This meant integrating the various aspects of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, persona and shadow, ego and self, into a functioning whole. It meant becoming who you truly are, fulfilling your unique potential, finding your particular path. Individuation was a lifelong process, never fully complete, always requiring further work and integration. It was not about perfection, but about wholeness. Not about eliminating the shadow, but about integrating it. Not about achieving some final enlightenment, but about the ongoing dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious. The individuated person was someone who had done this work sufficiently to live authentically, to relate genuinely to others, to contribute their unique gift to the world. For McKenna, the goal was not individuation but transformation, not the perfection of the human but its transcendence. He spoke often of the archaic revival, the idea that human consciousness needed to recover something it had lost, some connection to the visionary and the sacred that had been suppressed by civilization. But this recovery was not a return to the past, so much as a spiraling forward into a new mode of being that would integrate the archaic wisdom with the technological and intellectual achievements of modernity. More radically, McKenna envisioned a coming transformation so profound that it would amount to the emergence of a new species or a new phase of cosmic evolution. This was the eschaton, the transcendental object at the end of time, the point toward which all of history was moving. He was vague about what this would actually entail, sometimes describing it as a technological singularity, sometimes as a psychedelic apotheosis, sometimes as a kind of cosmic orgasm or hyperdimensional birthing. The time wave theory was his attempt to map this approaching transformation, to show that it was not random but followed a pattern, that the acceleration of novelty and complexity in human history was building toward a climax. Whether this was literal prediction or poetic metaphor, McKenna seemed at times uncertain, but he was convinced that consciousness was on the verge of some kind of phase transition, some shift that would be as momentous as the emergence of life from matter or consciousness from life. Jung would see in this eschatological vision an archetypal pattern, the age-old myth of the end times, the apocalypse, the eschaton. This pattern appears in many religions and cultures, the idea that history is building toward a culmination, a final revelation, a transformation that will redeem all suffering and resolve all contradictions. It is a powerful myth that can mobilize tremendous energy and hope, but it can also lead to disappointment and disillusionment when the predicted transformation fails to arrive. Moreover, Jung would likely see McKenna's eschatology as a projection, a way of externalizing and collectivizing what is actually an individual psychological process. The transformation that McKenna was predicting for humanity might actually be the transformation that he himself was experiencing through his psychedelic explorations, projected onto the cosmic screen. The eschaton, at the end of time, might be a symbol for the self at the center of the psyche, the goal of individuation misunderstood as a historical event rather than recognized as a psychological process. McKenna would probably not be entirely troubled by this interpretation. He was aware that his ideas could be understood psychologically as well as cosmologically, that the line between inner and outer, between psychological and metaphysical, was itself one of the boundaries that the psychedelic experience dissolved. Perhaps the eschaton was both an inner transformation and a cosmic event, both psychological and metaphysical, both personal and collective. The either-or thinking that insisted on choosing between these interpretations was itself part of the limited consciousness that needed to be transcended. This brings us to one of the most interesting points of convergence between Jung and McKenna, their shared suspicion of the either-or logic of conventional rationality, their both-and approach that sought to hold paradoxes and embrace contradictions. Jung's notion of the transcendent function, the psychological process that mediates between conscious and unconscious, between opposing viewpoints, between thesis and antithesis, was based on the idea that psychological growth often comes through the tension of opposites rather than through choosing one side. The symbol, in Jung's understanding, was the expression of this transcendent function, holding together meanings that logic would keep separate, pointing toward a unity that transcends rational categories. The mandala, the alchemical images, the great religious symbols, these worked precisely because they held contradictions in creative tension, because they could not be reduced to single meanings but remained ambiguous and multivalent. McKenna, too, emphasized paradox and ambiguity. The way the psychedelic experience resisted simple interpretation, the way it could be both terrifying and beautiful, both alien and familiar, both revealing truth and creating illusion. He spoke of the importance of maintaining multiple perspectives, of not collapsing the mystery into a single explanation. His speaking style reflected this, spiraling around his subject rather than attacking it directly, approaching it from multiple angles, contradicting himself, and then recontextualizing the contradiction. Both men, then, were working against the reductionist tendencies of modern rationality, against the desire to explain away mystery and complexity in favor of simple, single-level explanations. Both insisted that the psyche, or consciousness, or reality, was more strange and multidimensional than the scientific materialism of their eras acknowledged. Both sought to rehabilitate ways of knowing, symbolic, imaginal, visionary, that modernity had dismissed as primitive or pathological, yet they differed in how far they were willing to go with this rehabilitation. Jung sought to find a place for the symbolic and imaginal within a broadly scientific worldview, to show that one could take these dimensions seriously without abandoning rationality or science. His psychology was meant to be empirical, based on observation and experience, even if the phenomena it studied, dreams, visions, archetypal patterns, were not physical in the conventional sense. McKenna was more willing to break with the scientific worldview entirely, to suggest that science as currently constituted was too narrow, too bound by materialist assumptions, to encompass the full range of what consciousness could reveal. The psychedelic experience pointed toward a different kind of knowledge, a gnosis that could not be reduced to propositional statements or tested by conventional scientific methods. This knowledge was nonetheless real, perhaps more real than the knowledge produced by the limited methods of establishment science. We might say that Jung was attempting to expand science to include the psychological and the symbolic, while McKenna was suggesting that the psychedelic gnosis transcended science altogether, that it belonged to a different category of knowing. Jung wanted to make the imaginal respectable, to give it a place in the academy and the clinic. McKenna was content to let it remain wild and strange, the province of visionaries and shamans rather than doctors and professors. This difference reflects their different relationships to institutions and authority. Jung, despite his break with Freud and his exploration of unorthodox territories, remained essentially an establishment figure. He had his practice, his institute, his students and followers who carried on his work in relatively systematic ways. He wrote for academic and professional audiences, engaged with other scholars, sought to build a coherent body of thought that could be taught and applied. McKenna remained outside the establishment, a countercultural figure who spoke at psychedelic conferences and raves, who published with small presses and circulated through underground networks. He had no institute, no formal students, no systematic method that could be taught. He had followers and admirers, certainly, but they were inspired by his vision and his eloquence rather than trained in a particular technique. Both roles are valuable, both necessary. Jung showed that the imaginal and the archetypal could be engaged seriously, that depth psychology could be a legitimate field of study and practice. His work opened doors within the establishment, made it possible for later psychologists to explore transpersonal and spiritual dimensions without losing credibility. McKenna kept alive the wild and radical dimensions of consciousness exploration, the sense that there are territories that the establishment will never fully acknowledge or integrate, that must be explored by adventurers willing to risk the journey without institutional support. Their different relationships to healing and therapy also deserve consideration. Jung was first and foremost a healer, someone whose primary concern was the suffering of his patients and the possibility of their transformation and wholeness. His explorations of the unconscious, his theoretical developments, his engagement with alchemy and mythology, all this was ultimately in service of the therapeutic work, of helping people navigate their psychological crises and develop more fully. The analytic process, as Jung practiced it, was a long-term relationship, sometimes lasting years, in which analyst and patient together explored the patient's dreams and associations, active imagination exercises, and life situations. The analyst was not a blank screen, as in Freudian practice, but an engaged participant who brought their own personality and insights to the relationship. The goal was not just symptom relief, but fundamental transformation, the individuation process that would help the patient become more fully themselves. McKenna was not a therapist and never claimed to be. He was, as he sometimes described himself, an explorer and a reporter, someone who had been to strange territories and was telling others what he had found there. He saw value in the psychedelic experience for personal growth and healing, certainly, but that was not his primary focus. He was interested in consciousness itself, in the possibilities of human awareness, in the dimensions of reality that ordinary consciousness filtered out. This meant that McKenna's work had a different quality, less focused on individual healing and more focused on collective transformation, less concerned with integrating people into society and more concerned with transforming society itself, or even moving beyond it. The psychedelic experience was not primarily therapy, but exploration, not healing, but revelation. Jung would likely worry that this approach could leave people ungrounded, could open them to experiences they were not prepared to integrate, could trigger psychological crises without providing adequate support for working through them. The analytic relationship, in Jung's view, provided a container, a safe space where the unconscious could be engaged without overwhelming the ego. The analyst's presence and guidance helped the patient navigate difficult material, interpret confusing symbols, maintain their footing when the ground shifted. McKenna might respond that the therapeutic relationship, with all its support and structure, could also limit the experience, could domesticate the wild dimensions of consciousness, could subtly enforce conformity to social norms under the guise of psychological health. The solo journey, or the journey within a community of explorers rather than under the guidance of a professional, offered different possibilities. More risk, certainly, but also more freedom, more authentic encounter with the unknown. The question of set and setting, crucial in psychedelic work, reflects this difference. Set refers to the mindset, the psychological preparation and expectations one brings to the experience. Setting refers to the physical and social environment in which the experience unfolds. McKenna emphasized the importance of set and setting, recommending silent darkness for the deep psilocybin journey, supportive companions for integration afterward, careful attention to dose and substance and intention. But this was still quite different from the therapeutic container Jung advocated. McKenna was describing conditions for a solo exploration, for an individual's encounter with the mystery, not for a therapeutic relationship with a trained guide. He thought that too much guidance could actually interfere with the experience, could impose interpretations and expectations that limited what could be discovered. Better to go in as open as possible, with as few preconceptions as possible, and let the experience teach what it would. Jung would see this as potentially reckless, potentially dangerous, especially for people without adequate ego strength or psychological stability. But McKenna might reply that Jung's caution reflected a medical model, a focus on pathology and healing that was appropriate for his work with patients but not applicable to healthy individuals seeking to expand their consciousness. The psychedelic journey was not a treatment for illness but an exploration of possibility and different standards applied. Let us turn now to their relationships with specific cultural and intellectual traditions, the lineages they drew upon and contributed to. Jung's work was deeply rooted in Western esoteric traditions, alchemy, Gnosticism, Christian mysticism, Neoplatonism. He spent years studying the alchemical texts of the medieval and Renaissance periods, finding in them a symbolic representation of the individuation process. The alchemist's quest to transform base metal into gold was, Jung argued, a projection of the psychological work of transforming the base aspects of the personality into the gold of the integrated self. He also drew extensively on Eastern traditions, particularly from his engagement with Richard Wilhelm, the German sinologist who introduced him to Chinese alchemy and Taoism. Jung wrote commentaries on texts like the I Ching and The Secret of the Golden Flower, finding in them anticipations of his own psychological insights. He had respectful but limited engagement with Indian philosophy and Buddhism, appreciating their depth but remaining convinced that Westerners needed to find their own path rather than simply adopting Eastern practices. His relationship with Christianity was complex. He was the son of a Protestant pastor, grew up immersed in Christian symbolism, but could not accept the dogmatic and literal interpretations of the tradition. Yet he saw in Christian symbols the Trinity, the Incarnation, the cross, the figure of Christ as the self, profound psychological truths. His late work, Answer to Job, was a radical reinterpretation of the Book of Job that suggested God himself underwent development, that the inclusion of Christ as the incarnation of the self represented a transformation in the God image. McKenna drew on a different set of traditions, primarily shamanic and psychedelic. He was deeply influenced by the ethnobotanical work of Richard Evans Schultes and others who had documented the use of psychoactive plants in indigenous cultures. He saw these traditions as preserving knowledge that Western civilization had lost or suppressed, knowledge about the visionary dimensions of consciousness and their role in culture and spirituality. He was particularly drawn to the pre-Columbian cultures of Mesoamerica, with their use of psilocybin mushrooms and other entheogens in religious ceremonies. He speculated about the role of psychedelics in the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece, in the soma of the Vedic hymns, in the origins of Christianity and other religions. His notion of the archaic revival was precisely the idea that these suppressed shamanic dimensions needed to be recovered and integrated into modern consciousness. Unlike Jung, McKenna had little interest in alchemy or medieval mysticism. He saw these as too abstract, too intellectual, too far removed from the direct experience of plant medicine. The alchemists were, in his view, dealing with symbolic transformations when they could have been engaging with the actual immediate transformations that psychedelics induced. Why work with symbols of transformation when you could experience the thing itself? This reflects a fundamental difference in their approaches to the symbolic. For Jung, the symbol was primary, was the medium through which the unconscious expressed itself and through which transformation occurred. The symbol participated in what it represented, carried actual psychological power. To engage seriously with a symbol through meditation, active imagination, artistic expression was to engage with the reality it pointed toward. For McKenna, the symbol was secondary, a representation of experiences that could be had directly through psychedelic means. The value of mythology and religious symbolism was retrospective. These traditions preserved memories of the shamanic, visionary consciousness that had once been central to human culture. But rather than studying the symbols, one should return to the source, should take the sacred plants and have the experiences that generated the symbols in the first place. This difference also reflects their relationships to language and conceptuality. Jung was deeply invested in concepts, in developing a theoretical framework that could organize and make sense of psychological phenomena. His elaborate vocabulary of archetypes and complexes, His theories of psychological types and the functions of consciousness, his notions of synchronicity and the transcendent function, all this represented an attempt to create a conceptual architecture that could house the experiences he was describing. McKenna was more suspicious of conceptual frameworks, seeing them as potentially limiting, as imposing order on something that exceeded order. He developed his own concepts, certainly novelty, the time wave, the archaic revival, but he held them more lightly, was more willing to contradict himself, to suggest that his theoretical apparatus was more poetic than scientific, more a way of pointing toward mysteries than a way of explaining them. Both men, interestingly, had significant engagement with science fiction and speculative fiction. Jung read and discussed science fiction, seeing in it modern myth-making, the collective unconscious expressing itself through contemporary imagery. The UFO phenomenon, as we mentioned, he interpreted as a modern myth, a manifestation of archetypal content in space-age clothing. McKenna was an avid reader of science fiction and often referenced authors like Philip K. Dick, William S. Burroughs, and the Strugatsky brothers. He saw in science fiction, especially in its more psychedelic and reality-bending varieties, imaginative explorations of the same territories he was visiting through mushrooms and DMT. The sense of alternative realities, of consciousness manipulating matter, of encounters with alien intelligence. These were not just literary devices, but genuine possibilities that both science fiction and psychedelics pointed toward. Philip K. Dick is worth a special mention here, as his work and his personal experiences seem to occupy a space between Jung's psychological interpretation and McKenna's more literalist approach. Dick experienced a series of visions in 1974 that he spent the rest of his life trying to understand, writing thousands of pages of notes in his exegesis, attempting to interpret what had happened to him. He entertained multiple explanations, psychological, theological, science-fictional, without settling definitively on any single one. A Jungian might read Dick's experiences as an eruption of the collective unconscious, an overwhelming influx of archetypal material that Dick tried to understand through his own particular idiom of Gnosticism and science fiction. McKenna might see Dick's visions as a spontaneous breakthrough into the kind of hyperdimensional awareness that psychedelics induce chemically, a glimpse through the veil that the dying brain or the brain under extreme stress can sometimes provide even without plant medicines. Dick himself seemed to oscillate between these kinds of interpretations, sometimes thinking he had encountered a genuine external intelligence, which he called VALIS, Vast Active Living Intelligence System, sometimes thinking it was all a psychological or neurological phenomenon, sometimes thinking these categories themselves were inadequate to what he had experienced. His work thus exemplifies the ambiguity that surrounds visionary experience, the way it resists reduction to any single explanatory framework. As you rest more deeply now, let your mind drift with these questions, these territories where Jung and McKenna meet and diverge. Let the images arise: Jung in his tower, carving, stone and painting mandalas, McKenna in the darkness with his mushrooms, both of them seeking contact with something beyond the everyday ego, something profound and transformative and real. Different paths, different methods, different interpretations, but a shared conviction that consciousness is far stranger and more multidimensional than the mainstream culture acknowledges. Now, in the final movement of our exploration tonight, let us move into more reflective territory, considering what their dialogue reveals about the nature of consciousness, about the possibilities and limits of human knowing, about the relationship between psyche and cosmos. This is not a matter of determining who was right, Jung or McKenna, but of seeing how their different perspectives complement each other, how the conversation between them opens up spaces of understanding that neither could reach alone. Consider first the question of autonomy and the other. Both Jung and McKenna encountered figures and forces that seemed independent of their conscious will, that seemed to come from beyond the ego. For Jung, this was evidence of the unconscious as a genuinely other dimension of the psyche, distinct from consciousness, even though ultimately part of the same psyche. The unconscious was not just forgotten memories or repressed desires, but a creative source, a realm of possibilities and patterns that preceded and exceeded personal experience. For McKenna, the otherness was more radical, not just another part of the psyche, but something genuinely external, genuinely alien. The mushroom entity was not a projection but an ambassador, not a symbol but an actual intelligence from dimensions beyond the human sphere. This interpretation makes the universe far stranger, far more populated, far more meaningful than the modern materialist worldview allows. Is there a way to hold both perspectives simultaneously? Perhaps. The archetypal unconscious that Jung described is itself something other than the personal ego, something that has its own patterns and intentions, something that is not under conscious control. To encounter an archetype in its full power is to encounter something that feels utterly alien, utterly other, something that exceeds and overwhelms the personal. Perhaps what Jung called archetypes and what McKenna called alien entities are different ways of naming the same encounter with otherness within and beyond consciousness. Or perhaps they are genuinely different phenomena that get confused because of their similar phenomenology. Perhaps some visionary experiences are encounters with the collective unconscious, with archetypal structures of the human psyche, while other experiences, particularly those induced by powerful psychedelics, are something else entirely, genuine contacts with non-human intelligence. The challenge is that, from within the experience, it may be impossible to tell which is which, or whether the distinction even makes sense. This brings us to the question of epistemology. How do we know what we know? Jung's approach was empirical in an extended sense, he observed. Psychological phenomena, collected data from dreams and associations and active imagination, looked for patterns across individuals and cultures. The collective unconscious was a hypothesis to explain the patterns he observed, particularly the recurrence of similar symbols and motifs in contexts where direct cultural transmission seemed unlikely. But Jung also acknowledged the limits of this approach. The ultimate nature of the archetypes remained mysterious. Were they structures of the brain? Patterns inherited genetically? Something else entirely? Jung could not say with certainty. All he could do was describe their manifestations and effects in human experience. This was a kind of phenomenological approach describing the phenomena as they appeared without claiming to know their ultimate metaphysical status. McKenna's epistemology was more direct and experiential. The psychedelic gnosis was self-validating, carried its own evidence in the intensity and coherence of the experience. When the mushroom entity spoke, when the DMT elves appeared, their reality was undeniable in the moment. The challenge came later, when trying to communicate the experience or to square it with ordinary reality. But the experience itself provided a kind of knowledge that was immediate and certain, even if it could not be verified by others or tested by conventional scientific methods. This is the epistemology of mysticism and gnosis, which has a long history in Western and Eastern traditions. The mystic knows through direct experience, through union with or revelation from the divine or the absolute or the ground of being. This knowledge is often described as ineffable, as exceeding the capacity of language and concepts to capture it. It is known with certainty by the one who experiences it, but cannot be fully communicated to others. Jung was skeptical of claims to certain knowledge, especially knowledge that could not be articulated or shared. He valued the mystical experience, but insisted that it had to be integrated into consciousness, had to be brought into relationship with the ego, had to be understood psychologically. The person who simply claimed to know through mystical experience, without being able to explain or demonstrate what they knew, was claiming a special status that Jung found problematic. Yet Jung also acknowledged that some things could not be fully articulated, that the self remained ultimately mysterious, that the depths of the unconscious exceeded any conceptual grasp. His own most profound experiences, which he described in memories, dreams, reflections, had a numinous quality that transcended rational understanding. He had encountered something that felt absolutely real and meaningful, something that shaped his life and work, but something he could not fully explain to others or even to himself. So perhaps the difference between Jung and McKenna on this point is more a matter of emphasis than absolute disagreement. Both encountered mysteries that exceeded rational understanding. Both tried to find language to convey these mysteries while acknowledging the limits of language. Jung emphasized the work of integration and understanding, even of what could not be fully understood. McKenna emphasized the irreducible strangeness and otherness, the way the mystery resisted assimilation into familiar categories. The question of purpose or meaning also separates and unites them. For Jung, the psyche had a telos, a direction, which was individuation. The self was not just a concept, but a kind of attractor, pulling the person toward wholeness and integration. Dreams and symptoms and synchronicities were all communications from the unconscious, pointing toward this goal. The neuroses and sufferings that brought people into therapy were often signs that they had deviated from their individual path, that they were living inauthentically, that they needed to make changes to align with their deeper self. This gave Jung's psychology a profoundly meaningful structure. Suffering was not random but purposeful, pointing toward growth and transformation. The psyche was not just a mechanism but a system striving toward wholeness, toward the realization of its inherent potential. This teleological understanding differentiated Jung from Freud's more mechanistic and deterministic view, where the psyche was shaped by past events and driven by instincts, without any inherent direction toward growth or meaning. McKenna, too, saw purpose and direction, but on a cosmic rather than individual scale. The universe itself was evolving towards some kind of culmination, some flowering of consciousness and complexity that he called the eschaton. Human history, with its accelerating change, its increasing novelty, was part of this larger cosmic process. We were not just randomly drifting, but being pulled toward a destination, a transformation that would be as significant as any in cosmic history. This cosmological teleology gave McKenna's vision a prophetic quality. He was not just describing what is, but what is coming. Not just exploring consciousness, but announcing its imminent transformation. The psychedelic experience was valuable not just for personal growth, but as a preview of this coming transformation, a way of glimpsing the post-human consciousness that the eschaton would bring. Jung would likely see McKenna's cosmological teleology as a projection, as the individuation process writ large across history and cosmos. The self that Jung saw as the goal of individual development, McKenna saw as the goal of cosmic evolution. Both were describing a movement toward wholeness and integration, toward the realization of potential, but at different scales. But is it really a projection, or is it a recognition that the patterns Jung observed in individual psyches are actually reflections of larger patterns that structure reality itself? This is the question that Jung's notion of synchronicity begins to address. If mind and matter are both expressions of a deeper unity, if the psyche and the physical world are two aspects of the annus mundus, then perhaps the patterns of psychological development do reflect cosmic patterns. Perhaps individuation is not just a human process, but an expression of something universal. The way the universe itself is individuating is coming to consciousness. This is a place where Jung's thought borders on the kind of cosmological speculation that he usually avoided, but it is also where his deepest insights lead. The archetype, he sometimes suggested, might be not just psychological, but psychoid, having both psychological and physical aspects, existing somehow at the boundary between mind and matter. This would explain synchronicity, the way archetypal constellations in the psyche could coincide with events in the outer world. It would suggest that the psyche and the cosmos are more intimately related than Cartesian dualism allows. McKenna would take this further, dissolving the boundary between psyche and cosmos entirely, suggesting that consciousness is the fundamental reality of which matter is a manifestation. This is the idealist position, with roots in philosophers like Berkeley and Hegel, with parallels in certain interpretations of quantum mechanics where the observer plays a constitutive role in determining what is observed. If consciousness is primary, then the psychedelic expansion of consciousness is not just a change in subjective experience, but a change in reality itself, a movement into dimensions that are as real as the ordinary three-dimensional world, perhaps more real. Jung remained too empirical, too grounded in the observable, to go quite this far, but his work pointed in that direction, opened possibilities that his followers have continued to explore. The relationship between psyche and matter, between consciousness and the physical world, remains one of the great mysteries that both depth psychology and physics are still grappling with. Let us consider also their different relationships to chaos and order, to structure and spontaneity. Jung's method required careful attention to structure the therapeutic frame, the regular sessions, the ongoing relationship with the analyst, the patient recording of dreams, the disciplined practice of active imagination. Even his personal life, despite the intensity of his inner experiences, maintained regular patterns: his professional work, his family life, his routines at Bollingen. This structure was not limiting but enabling, providing the container within which the unconscious could safely express itself. McKenna, by contrast, seemed to value spontaneity and unpredictability, the way the psychedelic experience resisted routinization and structure. Each journey was unique, could not be fully predicted or controlled. The set and setting could be prepared, but what happened within the experience was up to the medicine and the moment. This unpredictability was part of the value, kept the experience fresh and alive, prevented it from becoming just another technique or system. Yet McKenna also had his structures, his regular practice of taking the heroic dose, his decades-long relationship with the mushroom, his routines of cultivation and preparation. And Jung also valued spontaneity, the way dreams arose unbidden, the way synchronicities appeared unexpectedly, the way the unconscious communicated through slips and accidents and sudden insights. So perhaps they differed not so much in their valuation of chaos and order, but in where they placed the emphasis. Jung more on the containing structure, and McKenna more on the disruptive content. Both chaos and order, structure and spontaneity, seem necessary for psychological growth and for the exploration of consciousness. Too much structure and the experience becomes sterile, predictable, loses its transformative power. Too much chaos and the experience becomes overwhelming, cannot be integrated, may lead to disintegration rather than growth. The art is in finding the balance, the right amount of structure to contain the chaos, the right amount of chaos to break through stagnant structures. This balance point will be different for different individuals in different contexts. Jung's therapeutic patients often needed more structure, more containment, because they were already struggling with chaos in their lives, already dealing with the eruption of unconscious content that they could not manage. McKenna's psychedelic explorers were often starting from a place of excessive order, overly structured lives and identities that needed to be loosened and opened, needed an injection of chaos to break through the rigidities. The dialogue between Jung and McKenna can thus be seen as a dialogue between container and contained, between structure and energy, between the vessel that holds and the force that fills. Both are necessary. The Jungian emphasis on integration and ego strength provides the vessel. The McKennian emphasis on radical opening and ego dissolution provides the force. Together they describe a complete cycle of descent and return, dissolution and reintegration, death and rebirth. This cyclical understanding appears in both their works, though in different forms. Jung described the process of individuation as involving periodic descents into the unconscious, encounters with shadow and archetype, followed by return and integration. The journey to the underworld is a recurring mythological motif that Jung saw as representing this psychological process. The hero must descend, must face the darkness, must die in some sense, before returning transformed. McKenna's time-wave theory also described cycles, though nested and spiraling rather than simply repeating. The wave of novelty moved through periods of habit formation and habit breaking, stable order giving way to creative chaos before settling into new patterns that would themselves eventually be disrupted. History as a whole was undergoing this process on the largest scale, building toward the ultimate break with habit that would be the eschaton. Both visions honor the necessity of death and dissolution in the process of growth and transformation. Nothing new can emerge without the dissolution of what was. The ego must die, at least temporarily, for the self to be born. The old structures must break down for new forms to arise. This is the wisdom of the initiatory traditions, the mystery religions, the shamanic death and rebirth. It is also the wisdom of depth psychology and the psychedelic experience. The question is how to undergo this death without it becoming literal death, how to dissolve the ego without destroying the person. This is where method and guidance and container become crucial. Jung's therapeutic relationship and discipline practices provide one kind of protection. McKenna's temporary, chemically induced dissolution provides another. The sacred rituals and structures of traditional shamanic cultures provide yet another. In each case, there is some framework that allows the death to be temporary, that ensures the return and the integration of what was learned in the depths. Our modern culture, McKenna often observed, lacks these frameworks. We have abandoned the traditional rituals and initiatory structures without replacing them with anything adequate. This leaves people vulnerable to psychological and spiritual crises without adequate support. The mental health system, focused on symptom management and adjustment to social norms, often pathologizes exactly the kinds of transformative crises that traditional cultures would have recognized as initiation. And the remaining religious institutions, drained of their visionary content, their mystical depth, offer ritual forms that no longer carry the living power they once held. Both Jung and McKenna, in their different ways, were trying to address this deficit, to provide frameworks for engaging with the transformative dimensions of experience in a modern context. Jung did this by developing analytical psychology as a systematic practice, training analysts who could guide others through psychological transformation. McKenna did it by speaking publicly about the psychedelic experience, by describing the territories and providing encouragement for others to explore them, by insisting that these dimensions were real and accessible and important. Neither solution is complete or fully satisfying. The Jungian approach can become too domesticated, too professional, too safe. The McKennian approach can be too wild, too unguided, too risky, but together they bracket a territory of possibility, suggesting different ways that modern individuals might engage with the depths and the heights, with the visionary and transformative dimensions of consciousness. What, then, is the imaginal realm that both explored? Is it the collective unconscious with its archetypal structures, as Jung maintained? Is it a hyperdimensional space populated by autonomous entities, as McKenna suggested? Is it the unus mundus, the unified reality that underlies the apparent split between mind and matter? Is it the Godhead, the Absolute, the ground of being that mystics have sought through the ages? Perhaps it is all of these and none of these. Perhaps it exceeds any of our categories and concepts. Perhaps the most honest answer is that we do not know, that we have mapped some of its territories and encountered some of its inhabitants, but that it remains ultimately mysterious, ultimately beyond our full comprehension. Jung and McKenna were both cartographers of this realm, producing different maps based on their different journeys, their different methods, their different starting points and destinations. These maps are not identical, do not show the same features or use the same symbols or suggest the same interpretations, but they are maps of something, some territory that is genuinely there to be explored, some dimension of experience that is real even if its reality is strange and difficult to categorize. The fact that we have multiple maps, that different explorers have brought back different reports, does not mean that the territory does not exist. It may mean that the territory is large and complex, that it reveals different aspects to different explorers, that no single map can capture its totality. This is the both-and thinking that both Jung and McKenna valued in their different ways. We do not have to choose between psychological and metaphysical interpretations, between inner and outer, between archetype and entity. We can hold the tension, can entertain multiple perspectives, can recognize that our categories may be inadequate to the phenomena we are trying to understand. The imaginal realm is psychological and more than psychological, is human and more than human, is subjective and objective and something that transcends that distinction. What does it mean to live with these mysteries? To orient one's life around depths that can never be fully plumbed, around questions that can never be fully answered. Both Jung and McKenna did this, devoted their lives to exploring and describing territories that resisted definitive mapping, that always promised more than could be known. This requires a certain kind of courage, a willingness to live with uncertainty while still making commitments, still offering interpretations, still guiding others. It also requires a kind of humility, a recognition that one's own understanding is limited, that other explorers may discover different things, that the mystery will outlast all our attempts to explain it. Jung, for all his authority and the systematic nature of his psychology, remained tentative about his ultimate claims, always insisting that he was describing psychological phenomena without claiming to know their ultimate metaphysical status. McKenna, for all his bold speculations and prophetic tone, often acknowledged that he might be wrong, that his theories were poetic as much as scientific, that the mystery exceeded his grasp. This humility in the face of mystery is perhaps the deepest wisdom that their dialogue offers. We live in an age that claims to know more than any previous age, that has mapped the genome and probed the atom and sent spacecraft to the edge of the solar system. And yet consciousness remains mysterious. The depths of the psyche remain largely unexplored. The relationship between mind and matter remains unsolved. Jung and McKenna remind us that there are territories that cannot be explored by the methods of conventional science, dimensions of experience that require different approaches, different kinds of knowing. They also remind us that these territories are not just interesting curiosities, not just exotic destinations for recreational exploration. They matter profoundly for how we understand ourselves, how we live our lives, how we face the great challenges of individual existence and collective survival. The modern crisis is not just political or economic or environmental, though it is all of these. It is also, perhaps primarily, a crisis of meaning, of consciousness, of connection to the depths. Jung saw neurosis as often rooted in the loss of connection to the symbolic and mythic dimensions of existence, the modern reduction of life to material concerns and ego pursuits. McKenna saw civilization as toxic, as actively suppressing the visionary consciousness that could show us different ways of being, different possibilities for human culture. Both were calling for a kind of rekindling, a return to the sources, a recovery of dimensions of consciousness that modernity had banished or forgotten. This is not a simple return to the past, not a naive rejection of modern knowledge and achievement. Jung was deeply engaged with modern science and sought to place his psychology in dialogue with it. McKenna was fascinated by modern technology and saw in it the potential for new forms of consciousness and culture, but both insisted that modern rationality and materialism were insufficient, that they left out essential dimensions of human experience, that they needed to be complemented by other ways of knowing. The archaic revival that McKenna called for was not a rejection of the modern, but an integration, a bringing forward of ancient wisdom into contemporary contexts, a synthesis of the shamanic and the scientific, the visionary and the technological. Jung's project was similar to integrate the insights of depth psychology with modern consciousness, to give the archetypal and symbolic dimensions a place in modern life without abandoning the achievements of rationality and science. Whether such integration is possible remains an open question. The tensions are real, the contradictions difficult to resolve. How do you maintain scientific rigor while taking seriously experiences that cannot be replicated or measured? How do you honor the autonomous reality of the psyche while recognizing the physical basis of consciousness and brain function? How do you embrace the transformative power of visionary experience while maintaining the stability and structure necessary for daily life? These are questions that cannot be answered abstractly, but must be worked out in practice, in individual lives and in cultural experiments, in the ongoing dialogue between different perspectives and approaches. The conversation between Jung and McKenna is part of this larger dialogue, offering two distinct voices that illuminate different possibilities, different emphases, different paths. As you drift now towards sleep, let the images and ideas we have explored settle into your consciousness, like sediment in water, slowly filtering down finding their resting places in the depths of your own psyche. You have accompanied two explorers on their journeys through inner space, through the imaginal realm where consciousness meets something other than itself, where the boundaries dissolve and reform, where transformation happens. Jung, with his careful discipline and his commitment to integration, carving mandalas and engaging figures in dialogue, maintaining his practice and his connection to outer reality while exploring the depths. McKenna, with his heroic doses and his surrender to dissolution, encountering entities and traversing hyperdimensional spaces, bringing back reports of territories that reason cannot reach. Two paths, two methods, two maps of the same mysterious terrain. You do not have to choose between them. You can learn from both, can see how each illuminates what the other leaves in shadow, can use their different perspectives to develop a more complete understanding than either offers alone. The Jungian emphasis on integration and relationship, on maintaining ego structure while engaging the unconscious. The McKennian emphasis on radical opening and ego dissolution, on surrendering to the mystery and trusting the experience. Perhaps you will find your own path somewhere between or beyond these alternatives, drawing on their insights while following your own unique journey. This is, after all, what both would have wanted, not followers who simply repeat their teachings, but explorers who take what is useful and discover their own truths, who extend the maps they have drawn into territories not yet charted. The imaginal realm awaits, whether you approach it through active imagination or psychedelic journeys, through dream work or meditation, through art or ritual or contemplation. It is not somewhere else, but always present, always accessible, the dimension of depth that underlies and interpenetrates ordinary reality. Jung and McKenna were not unique in their ability to explore it, were not special or chosen. They were simply people who committed themselves to the journey, who took seriously what they encountered, who tried to bring back maps and reports that might help others. You have that same capacity, that same possibility. The collective unconscious is not Jung's private domain, but the shared depths of the human psyche, accessible to anyone willing to undertake the journey. The visionary dimensions that McKenna described are not exclusive to psychedelic explorers, but represent possibilities of consciousness that can be accessed through various means. The work that both invite is available to you if you choose to undertake it. But that work is not for tonight. Tonight is for rest, for allowing what you have heard to seep into the deeper layers of consciousness, to find its place in the ecology of your psyche. The active work, the deliberate exploration, can wait for another day. For now, simply rest. With the knowledge that consciousness is vast and mysterious, that you are more than you usually think you are, that depths and heights await your exploration when the time is right. Let Jung's voice remind you of the importance of groundedness and integration, of maintaining connection to the world even while exploring the depths. Let McKenna's voice remind you of the importance of radical openness and wonder, of not explaining away the mystery too quickly. Let both voices fade now into the silence from which they came, leaving you alone with your own inner process, your own journey towards sleep and dreams. The conversation between great minds continues, whether we are listening or not. Jung and McKenna and countless others have contributed to an ongoing dialogue about the nature of consciousness, the structure of the psyche, the relationship between self and cosmos. That dialogue is not finished, will perhaps never be finished, because the territory it explores is inexhaustible, always offering new dimensions to discover, new perspectives to integrate. You are part of this dialogue now, simply by listening, by contemplating, by allowing these ideas to work upon your consciousness. The questions they explored are also your questions. The mysteries they encountered are also your mysteries. Their answers, their maps, their interpretations may help guide you, but ultimately you must walk your own path, must have your own encounters, must develop your own understanding. And that is as it should be. The individuation that Jung spoke of, the transformation that McKenna prophesied, these are not collective events that happen to everyone in the same way. They are individual journeys, unique paths that each person must discover and walk for themselves. The guides and maps can help, but they cannot substitute for the actual journey. As sleep takes you now, let go of the effort to understand, the attempt to integrate and remember. Trust that what needs to remain will remain, that the ideas that matter to you will find their way into your consciousness in the days to come. Dreams may come that carry forward the themes we have explored, that show you in image and symbol what words can only approximate. Or sleep may simply be sleep, blank and restful, the necessary emptiness from which consciousness refreshes itself. Either way is fine. The dialogue between Jung and McKenna, between active imagination and psychedelic gnosis, between psychological integration and visionary exploration, this dialogue will continue, whether you are actively engaged with it or not. It is part of the larger conversation that humanity has been having with itself and with the cosmos for as long as we have been conscious enough to reflect on consciousness itself. Rest now in the knowledge that you are held by this larger context, that your individual journey participates in a collective exploration, that the questions you carry are also the questions of the species. You are not alone in your seeking, not isolated in your wondering about the nature of consciousness and reality and meaning. Jung and McKenna and countless others have walked before you, leaving maps and markers, and countless others will walk after you, building on what this generation discovers. The great work continues. The exploration of consciousness continues. The dialogue between different perspectives continues. But for now, for tonight, your work is simply to rest, to allow the seeds that have been planted in this conversation to germinate in the darkness of the unconscious, to trust the process that will bring them to fruit in their own time. Good night, wanderer of the waking world. May your dreams be peaceful or provocative as they need to be. May you wake refreshed and ready to continue your own unique journey. And may the dialogue between Jung and McKenna, between integration and exploration, between the psychological and the visionary, continue to inspire and guide you as you walk your own path through the great mystery of consciousness. The imaginal realm awaits, patient and eternal, ready to reveal its secrets to those who dare to look. But it will still be there tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that. For now, simply rest, let go, drift into sleep, and whatever dreams may come, carried on the currents of consciousness into the night.